Thank you very much, Carlock. In recommending this PMB to the House, I am conscious that mortgage distress and lack of social housing are two of the most important issues when it comes to dealing with housing. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak on the issue of social housing in the House tonight. There has certainly been much talk of housing, particularly relating to the issues faced by people at risk of losing their homes. But there has been very little debate on the solutions to these problems, even less dedicated to the continuing shortage of social housing. If you spent much time in this House, certainly listening to the government benches or looking at the topics for discussion, then you could be led to believe there was no issue with social housing. In fact, the only thing you would learn about social housing is that it apparently is getting too much money spent on it and needs a good cut at least once a year. You would be led to believe that those in social housing are well looked after, that they live very comfortable lives in good conditions, and those that aren't happy with their accommodation are most likely a bit too picky. But like most pictures this House paints of those hardest hit by this recession, or those who were already on the margins, it is a very distorted picture. Distorted by many things. Some deputies are out of touch, some are in denial, and some still look on those who avail of social housing as more targets for contempt than citizens deserving of their rights. Because that is what housing is. Despite what government policy might indicate, housing is a right. Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the European Social Charter recognises the right to housing as part of the right to an adequate standard of living. The UNHCR's General Comment number 4, the right to adequate housing, states, the human right to adequate housing, which is thus derived from the right to an adequate standard of living, is of central importance for the enjoyment of all economic, social and cultural rights. Can we really say that in 2013 this state provides that right to its people? Shamefully, we cannot. As the motion states, there are currently nearly 100,000 people on the housing waiting list of this state. In 1948, the first coalition government commissioned a report which found 59,000 homes were needed across the state to make up for a gap in provision and demand. That was just over 26 years after the foundation of the state. Now, 65 years later, we have nearly double demand, but are nowhere near providing for those numbers. In fact, we were providing less new social housing than we were in the 70s. The state has a shocking shortage of suitable homes it can provide for people, while there are tens of thousands of homes lying idle, which in many cases belong to developers who have been bailed out by the public purse. So who are these people the state is so badly failing to meet the needs of? Of course, the degree of need among this very large group varies, but I certainly have met and worked with many people who have their need described as severe and would not be in any way exaggerating this. I've met mothers who share their parents' couch with their 2 sons in a house of 11. She has no option but to wait and see, with the hope of getting onto the insecure and increasingly difficult scheme of rent supplement. She cannot get work if there was work to be found because she cannot sleep a wink, giving up the couch so her sons will not go to school too tired to pay attention. She sits in her mother's kitchen and hopes for some way out. Rent supplement by its nature perpetuates her poverty trap, her only hope, and yet only open to her if she is unemployed. This is a poverty trap which now takes in 94,000 people. That includes, in that figure, hundreds of thousands of men, women and children. A short-term stopgap to deal with the shortage of social housing when introduced, it has now become the government's best weapon in pretending they are providing housing. Instead, we have a system where the state is taking public money and subsidising private landlords, who are in too many cases not living up to the standards set for them, but all too rarely checked upon. In order to get rent supplement, you must be on the waiting list and be unemployed. Once you become part of the scheme, you must find your accommodation, which can be a difficult task, giving rising rents, poor standards, cramped conditions, and the fact some landlords, as a means of preemptive social cleansing, deny any prospective tenants in receipt of rent allowance. This scheme costs the state over $500 million a year and provides not one extra social housing unit at the end of each year. If rent is dead money, then rent supplement is much worse, given the potential this money could have to rebuild communities and the social housing stock in a long-term drive to provide for the needs of the people on these waiting lists. The government's other solution has to pretend that NAMA is delivering a social dividend. While yes, it is indeed supposed to be doing this, and a special purpose vehicle was created last year, it would seem to be a little bit of a charade. Having spent billions bailing out developers through NAMA, we are left with 179 homes delivered in 3 years, out of a promise of nearly 4,000, up from the original 2,000, which never materialised. But this scheme also will not deliver one extra social housing unit in the long term. Instead, developers in NAMA will be given an easy tenant for about 11 years. Estimates are that 2,000 homes will cost $14 million to the state a year. And NAMA developers lines his pockets while nothing is done to solve the continuing lack of housing. Sinn Fein have offered a solution. It was clearly laid out in our job creation package, released at the end of last year. A novel approach. It suggested that we actually provide housing as part of a public housing system. This minister and the last Minister for Housing stated that no big house building would be possible, but we have clearly shown how it can be done. In our jobs creation document, we highlighted how through the National Pension Reserve Fund, the European Investment Bank and incentivised investment from the private pension sector, we could raise funds which would include $1 billion for improving and increasing our social housing stock. This could fund the commencement of building of 9,000 homes in the next 2 years, coupled with a renewed focus on the delivery of the 3,949 properties identified for housing by NAMA, of which only 179 have so far been delivered. This would take a considerable number of people off the waiting list and save a considerable amount of money to the taxpayers. This $1 billion could also be used to improve maintenance of social housing and refurbish dilapidated units in order to make them available for housing families. Management companies are a big problem. With the taking in charge of many of these estates is going to happen sooner or later. The local authorities will be ended up in charge of many of these estates. And the traveller accommodation programme in Dublin City alone, in terms of maintenance, was cut from 1 million to 50,000 just for the maintenance. It's an absolute shame. We need a vision when it comes to housing. We need a new approach. We need an approach that says that housing is a right, that the people who need housing should be housed and shouldn't have to beg to get housing. Thank you.